Abraham was the first billionaire on earth, and the 3 wealth laws God gave him have been hiding in plain sight, buried inside stories most people read right past. Before Solomon wrote a single proverb about legacy, Abraham was already operating inside a financial covenant that modern economies cannot explain. Stay with this until the very end, because the final revelation will change not just how you think about money. It will change what you believe you are allowed to have. Here is what the world will not tell you. 4,000 years before economists built their models, before any university opened its doors, before the first central bank printed its first note, there was a man walking the ancient Near East who was richer than most nations. Genesis chapter 13, verse 2, does not use the word comfortable. It does not say Abraham was doing well. The text says he was very heavy in livestock, in silver and in gold. That word heavy in the original Hebrew, the word kabed, means crushing weight, the kind of wealth that bends the ground beneath it. What you are about to hear is an economic blueprint. Picture the wealthiest person you know. Now ask yourself honestly, how did they build it? Most of the time the answer is ugly when you look at it up close. There is usually debt at the center of it, the kind that never fully sleeps, and a constant undercurrent of fear that the whole structure could shift without warning. That is the texture of modern prosperity. It glitters on the surface, but underneath it shakes. Abraham's wealth had a completely different texture. That is the thing the history books miss. When the kings of the surrounding nations walked into battle, they wore their gold as currency for war. Their treasure was stored in temples, guarded by armies, always one raid away from disappearing. Abraham's capital could not be confiscated in that way. His livestock multiplied season after season. His servants were skilled and loyal. His household was a self-sustaining economic engine that kept generating even when he was not watching it. The difference between Abraham and those kings was not the size of the number. It was the nature of the foundation underneath it. Most people today are building on sand and calling it strategy. Here is the deception hiding inside modern financial culture. Everything sold to you as wealth is actually a chain dressed in silk. Banks sell mortgages as assets, but they actually chain your future to an obligation with a 30-year grip. A credit score measures how reliably you serve a system that was never designed with your freedom in mind. A stock portfolio that can be cut in half in 72 hours gives you a glossy brochure where a legacy should be. None of this is wisdom. It is the Sodom model of accumulation. Always taking in, never sending out, consuming relentlessly until it collapses under its own weight. The Bible describes a different architecture entirely. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18 says this, "Listen carefully to every word. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may confirm His covenant." That sentence does something no financial textbook does. It identifies the source. God is the source, not cleverness, not perfect timing, not who you happen to know. And the method of transfer is covenant, a binding agreement with terms, obligations, and a long-term inheritance clause already written in. Abraham was positioned inside a covenant economy, operating by laws that predate every market in human history. He did not stumble into any of it. This brings us to something most teachers of this story skip right over. The law of separation. Most people try to gather everything. They say yes to every opportunity. They mix every stream of income into one pool and never draw clear boundaries around what belongs to the covenant and what belongs to the system. Abraham did the opposite. When Lot chose the well-watered plains of Jordan, the region that looked like Egypt, lush and profitable and full of visible life, Abraham let him take it. To every observer around them, Abraham had just handed his nephew the better land, without a fight. But God responded to that act of separation with one of the most staggering promises in all of Scripture. Lift your eyes, look north, south, east, west. Everything you see, I will give to you and to your seed forever. Separation positioned Abraham for a promise that no amount of clever negotiation could have produced. It was a move inside a covenant economy that the natural eye simply cannot read from the outside. You cannot serve two systems at once. The moment you try to hold the Sodom model and the covenant model in the same hand, the weight becomes unbearable, and you quietly drop the one that costs you more in the short term. That is always the covenant. And that is always the beginning of slow, invisible erosion that you will not notice until years later when you look back and wonder where the blessing went. This is the moment. You feel it, don't you? Something in this is landing somewhere real. Drop a comment right now and tell us, where in the world are you watching this from? Because this message is crossing borders today, and we want to know exactly how far the covenant is traveling. Genesis chapter 13, verse 2 is an economic thesis statement written into the oldest book most people own. Abraham was very heavy, caved, in livestock, silver, and gold. Here is what most readers miss when they scan past that verse. Those three categories are not random selections. Livestock is productive capital. It breathes, it multiplies, it generates a continuous return without requiring Abraham to trade his hours for it. Silver and gold are stored value, durable, portable, stable across generations and across borders. And what is conspicuously absent from that entire picture? Debt, paper promises, speculation on things that do not yet exist. Abraham held real assets, things grounded in the physical world that could not be inflated away, things that passed to Isaac and then to Jacob and then cascaded forward into the 12 tribes of an entire nation. This is the Genesis 13:2 asset rule. Build in categories that multiply without consuming you, store value in things that survive economic seasons, and never let an obligation dress itself up as prosperity. The warning built into Lot's story deserves more than a passing read. Lot went to Sodom, and this carries an economic lesson as precise as any principle in the text. Sodom was the most resource-rich region in that entire territory. The text describes it as being like the garden of the Lord, abundant, lush, producing by every visible metric that a man of that era could measure. And Lot, reading his surroundings with natural eyes alone, moved his tent toward Sodom, and then eventually moved himself inside it. His prosperity became so entangled with a system corrupt at its root that when Sodom fell, there was no separating what was his from what was doomed. He escaped with his life and walked out with nothing else. The terrain you plant in determines whether your seed has a future. You can carry the right seed, real discipline, genuine diligence, a clear vision, and still lose everything because you chose to plant it inside a system built for consumption rather than covenant. The geography of your financial life is not a minor detail. Who you build with, what agreements you enter, what systems your income depends on. Lot had been in Abraham's household. He had watched the same God move. He had witnessed the same provision up close. But he planted in Sodom, and Sodom took everything with it when it burned. Watch what Abraham did after Sodom fell and Lot was taken captive. This is the part most teachers quietly move past. Abraham went to war. He recovered everything, and on his way back, carrying the recovered wealth of those captured kings, he met Melchizedek, priest of the Most High God. In Genesis chapter 14, verse 18 through 20, something happened that would not be fully explained for another 2,000 years, until the writer of Hebrews chapter 7 named it the oldest financial covenant in Scripture. Abraham gave 10% of everything, before the law of Moses existed, before the Levitical priesthood was established, before Israel had yet emerged as a nation. If you are still operating as though you are ahead of God in any of this, the evidence of Abraham's life disagrees with that quietly and completely. The tithe was demonstrated at Salem by the father of faith himself, long before Sinai made it law, and it was given as covenant alignment, a declaration that the victory belonged to God, that the wealth in his hands was not self-made, and that the flow would continue because the source was being honored openly. The power of covenant in business runs deeper than any contract between parties of equal standing. God has never broken his word once in all of human history. Every term he sets, he keeps. If this is resonating, if something in you is being stirred right now, take a second and give this video a like. You are marking yourself as someone who takes this seriously enough to act on it. Isaac was born into wealth, but he was not born into entitlement, and that distinction is everything. Abraham did not simply transfer numbers to his son, he transferred systems. He passed on the knowledge of how the covenant actually worked, the understanding that wealth without alignment becomes a trap you have to maintain forever without help. The inheritance was a method, and the character required to carry it was built into the transfer itself. This is what Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22 means when Solomon, standing at the far end of this same lineage, writes, "A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children." Read that word carefully. Good. God used that word, not sharp, not fortunate, not financially sophisticated. Character was what qualified the generational transfer, and capital only followed because of it. Most parents leave money. Abraham left a model of how to stay inside the covenant across generations. Those are two entirely different gifts with entirely different shelf lives. The real difference between generational wealth and generational memory comes down to this. One is an amount that can be spent, lost, or squandered in a single generation, and the other is an operating system that keeps regenerating because it stays connected to an unchanging source. Go deeper into the tithing principle, and something shifts that most teaching never reaches. When Abraham gave that 10% to Melchizedek, he was making a statement about the fundamental nature of everything he held. By releasing the first portion, before using any of it, before reinvesting it, before making a single plan with it, Abraham was declaring aloud that none of it had ever truly belonged to him in the first place. Luke chapter 16, verse 10 says it plainly, "Whoever is faithful with very little will also be faithful with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much." This is a stewardship test with an automatic outcome written into it, and it does not make exceptions based on how badly you want the next level. God does not give the next level to those who have not yet passed the current one. Sit with that. You may be in a season of real frustration right now, waiting for something to open, wondering why the increase is not coming, feeling like your effort is not matching your return. Here is the honest question worth asking in the quiet. Have you been genuinely faithful with what is already in your hands? With the actual amount you have today, not the amount you are hoping for? Because the law responds to faithfulness, and faithfulness starts with what is already in front of you. Excellence enters here as a covenant requirement with teeth in it. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 10 says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might." Abraham's household was run with precision. His 318 trained men, recorded in Genesis chapter 14, verse 14, were not volunteers who showed up unprepared. They were developed, equipped, and ready because Abraham had invested in building infrastructure around him that could actually carry the weight of covenant responsibility. Carelessness and sloppiness are forms of waste, and God requires better than waste from those who carry his name and his covenant forward. There is a moment in Genesis chapter 26 that almost nobody stops to examine. A famine had spread across the land, a real one, the kind that drove people to make desperate decisions. Isaac was preparing to leave Canaan and go down to Egypt, the same move his father had made in an earlier season of scarcity. And then the voice of God interrupted him before he could go. "Do not go to Egypt. Stay in this land. And I will be with you, and I will bless you." Isaac obeyed. He stayed. He planted crops in Canaan in the middle of a famine, which, from any rational perspective, looked like a decision born of either great faith or complete foolishness. And that same year, Genesis chapter 26, verse 12, records that he reaped 100-fold harvest. The text is not vague or approximate about this. 100-fold. Not a modest recovery, not a slight improvement over the previous season. 100-fold return in the very year that everyone around him was struggling to survive. This is the principle of sowing in famine, and it sits among the most counterintuitive laws you will find anywhere in Scripture. Every instinct built into human nature during seasons of scarcity says the same thing. Stop, protect what you have, conserve everything, wait for conditions to improve before you plant anything. But the covenant economy operates on a completely different logic. Plant now, trust the source rather than the season. Align yourself with a law that does not suspend itself just because rain stopped falling. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verses 1 and 2 carry this same thread across the centuries with quiet confidence. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Divide your portion among 7 or even 8, for you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. Keep giving, keep diversifying, keep planting in the ground of faithfulness rather than waiting for a forecast that feels comfortable enough to act on. Isaac planted in famine and came out the other side with abundance that made his neighbors uncomfortable, because of alignment with a law that was already in motion before he made his decision. Here is what almost no one will say to you directly. Faith and how you allocate your resources are the same subject seen from 2 angles, and you cannot separate them without distorting both. Where you put what you have is a confession. It tells the truth about what you actually believe, about the future, about God, about who you are inside the covenant. If every dollar you earn is spent maintaining an image of abundance you do not actually possess, that spending reveals something. It says you trust appearances more than promises, and that you are more loyal to the system you live inside than to the covenant you say you believe in. Isaac did not perform for anyone around him. He planted in silence and obeyed in a season where nothing looked promising. And then the harvest came so large that the Philistines grew envious and asked him to leave because his presence had become a quiet economic threat to everything around them. That is Isaiah chapter 58 verse 11 moving through the pages of the Old Testament in plain sight. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. When you align what you believe with how you actually allocate what you have, you stop being a stream and you become a spring. A stream is entirely dependent on what falls from the sky. A spring draws from something underground, something that moves through hidden channels, something that keeps flowing long after the surface has gone completely dry. King Solomon received the richest inheritance in human history, but the thread most people never pull on is this. Solomon did not receive gold first, he received wisdom first, and then the gold came as a consequence of what the wisdom produced. 1 Kings chapter 3 carries the account of Solomon's prayer, and what strikes most readers is the apparent selflessness of asking for wisdom instead of wealth. But the economy hidden inside God's response deserves more attention. Because you asked for wisdom to govern rightly, I will give you also what you did not ask for, both wealth and honor. That sequence cannot be reversed, and it cannot be negotiated around. Wisdom that produces justice, order, and systems that hold across generations, that kind of wisdom pulls provision toward it over time. You cannot carry it into the management of people and resources without eventually attracting the increase that follows it. This is exactly why Solomon wrote what he wrote in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22. He had not read it in a book. He had watched it happen in real time through his father David and through the covenant of Abraham, moving forward across every generation that stayed faithful. He understood through personal observation that generational inheritance gets built with intention, layer by layer, through the long and sometimes invisible obedience of people who trusted the covenant more than they trusted whatever season they happened to be standing in. So, what do you actually do with this in a practical sense today? You apply Abraham's 3 laws with honesty. The first law is separation. You look at every financial structure in your life right now and ask the straightforward question, does this multiply over time, or does it only consume? You identify the Sodom partnerships, the agreements that look productive on the surface, but are built on a foundation of consumption and appetite with no covenant underneath them. You let Lot take that land. Trust that the act of separation, painful as it may feel in the short term, is positioning you for a promise that your natural eye cannot yet see. The second law is tithing as covenant alignment, a deliberate declaration that the source of everything you have is God, and that the flow will remain continuous because you are choosing to honor the source openly rather than grip everything as though it originated with you. That one reorientation changes your entire relationship with increase. You stop operating from scarcity. You stop competing with people around you. You begin receiving because you stopped treating every resource like it might be the last one that ever comes. The third law is planting in famine. When conditions contract, when circumstances look hostile, when every reasonable voice around you is saying this is not the right time, find something to sow anyway, a skill you develop, a service you extend, a genuine act of generosity directed at someone who cannot repay you. Isaac's 100-fold return was covenant law producing its natural result in the life of a man who planted when the season said not to. Matthew chapter 25, verse 29, captures what the servants in the parable of the talents discovered through lived experience. To everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. God rewards faithful stewardship with multiplication, and it cannot fail to happen because the God who established this covenant has never broken his word across the entire span of human history. You are not watching this by accident. The fact that this message reached you, across whatever distance, through whatever screen, in this exact season of your life, is itself a form of provision directed specifically at you. Someone needed to hear this today, and you are that someone. Subscribe to this channel and carry these 3 laws with you, not as information you file away, but as a covenant way of seeing everything around you. Share this with one person in your life who needs to be reminded that this blueprint was written long before any financial system in this world existed, and that it has never stopped working. Not once, not for anyone who genuinely built their life on it. May the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one who calls things that are not as though they already are, open over your life the windows of heaven that no economic storm in this world has the power to close.